Yes, there we are. Oh, going back to our beautiful glowing creatures that John just showed you examples there. We did actually write about these a couple of years ago, and we wrote about some other studies that people have done of different Australian animals, not just geckos, but even platypuses and other Australian animals. And they found that quite a few of them glow in the dark. And so you can look that up on our fact file. The article is entitled Aussie Animals Glow in the Dark. And around about that time, we made this particularly beautiful gecko the part of our main banner for our newsletter. So do look that up. You don't need to know when newsletters were sent out to find the individual items. They're archived as separate items, so you can just do a normal keyword search and find them. But let's move on to this whole issue that scientists and evolutionists particularly claim that the shapes and colors that we see in animals are there to be camouflage. And one of the criticisms we get from the skeptics is, oh, well, if you believe in a very good world, well, who needed camouflage in a very good world? But we have these things which are very obviously camouflage. Now, going back to the peppered moth that Joseph just mentioned, you've got to think of a more underlying question. How could a change in the environment actually produce the genes that are required to change a color or a shape or something like that? That's one of the questions that the evolutionists never answer. But anyway, let's go back to a couple of other examples of things which are considered to be camouflage or to be there to deter predators and to somehow protect creatures from being eaten by other creatures. And why would you need that in a very good world? So here's a classic one. Butterflies and moths that have spots that look like eyes. Now, the other question you've got to think of is, well, we look at these things and we think they look like eyes, but what do the other creatures of the same species think? Do they think they look like eyes? How would they know what the eyes of a large animal look like? What goes on in their minds, as it were, as if they had minds. So we think these look like eyes, and they do. It's quite clever, and some of them even have this effect. Can you see in the picture there where you've got that little light area within the black area, which has the effect of looking like the sort of glint or shine that you get from the pupil of a big eye. So you think, that is really clever. This really does look like an eye. Is it a disguise that's been designed to or has the effect of deterring predators? Well, some scientists have just tried to look into this, and they have studied these so-called eye spots, and they found particularly the ones that have what looks like that sort of light glint in the pupil region is very highly reflective of ultraviolet light, and a lot of animals can see ultraviolet light, but we can't. So what they see is a little bit different to what we see. And so that brings up the question, well, what are the animals actually seeing? What are their own species seeing? And what are other animals seeing? So we've got to try and look at it from their point of view rather than from our point of view of saying, oh, well, we think this looks like eyes or something else. And so people have done experiments, and they found two things. One lot of experiments actually used artificial butterflies or that had different patterns of so-called eye spots, and they used these on different backgrounds to see whether they were more attractive to predators or less attractive to predators, and they found that the ones that had spots were actually more attractive to predators rather than less. So it's not actually a good disguise if that is a reflection of reality. The other thing is they found that the butterflies that have this spot with the reflective pupil actually attract females. And so this is probably the real function of these. If we go back to our very good world, no, it's not to do with deterring predators. It's actually to attract the opposite sex. So the reflective eye spots are really there as part of the natural world, where butterflies and moths hatch out, and the first thing they have to do is find a mate, because the butterflies and moths, being the reproductive part of the cycle of their life cycle, that's their main function, is to go and find the moths. So in fact, these reflective spots are there for a very good reason that is suitable in the very good world. And again, you've got to ask the question, if these things were there to deter predators, how did they get there by evolution? How many moths got eaten before they got they got eaten? Being eaten is not going to change the genes in a butterfly or a moth's genome in order to produce them. So the evolutionists come up with these throwaway lines, but they don't actually answer the question as to how it happens. And when you do the research and see what these things happen, they are very useful in the very good world. Now, the other classic example, of course, of a colour changing animal, like the beautiful gecko from Jurassic Ark, but the one that most people know about, of course, is the chameleon. And in fact, the word chameleon has become almost embedded in the language, not just referring to this little animal, but also the whole idea of blending into the background. If something has a chameleon change, or that word has become so much associated to blending into a background and being able to change color. And again, scientists have done experiments where they've tried to get into the minds of the animals themselves. Now, obviously, we can't do this, but you can set up experiments where you observe the behavior and see how they respond to a particularly controlled environment. And what they have found is that chameleons actually use their color changes for communication. They signal to other animals. Now, again, this can be for courtship, and so you do get these wonderful varieties of colors in chameleons, and they really are beautiful. And we have to remember that God actually likes beauty. Remember, it says in Genesis that he made the trees in the garden to be pleasing to the eye, as well as good for food. And I'm sure he made lots of animals to be pleasing to the eye. That beautiful little gecko that lives at Jurassic Ark, the chameleons, because they not only have color, they have all of these beautiful patterns as well. And they do signal to one another. They are quite territorial. Now, that doesn't mean they're necessarily aggressive. So they can signal to other chameleons, well, look, I'm here, and this is my territory. And that doesn't mean they have to fight one another. It's just a way of signaling, and also a way of attracting mates. So the colourful chameleon patterns are really colourful language in the proper sense of the word. Colourful language, in other words, they are using colour changes for communication. That is something that works very well in the very good world, and it's not to do with disguise or hiding from predators, just like the spot theory of the butterflies has been spoiled by the people who actually do the research from the point of view, how do these look to other animals or other species, or other creatures of the same species rather. Now, another creature or another group of creatures that change color, and this is a more slow change, are the creatures that have summer and winter coats. Now, these are a couple of examples from Scotland, but these occur particularly in animals that live up close to the Arctic Circle. So we have the mountain hare. In summer, it's a sort of brown color, and this is supposedly to help it hide in amongst the grasses and brackens and other plants that you have in the Scottish Highlands. When it comes to winter, of course, you have snow on the ground, and so it turns to white. And another example of this is a type of bird. It's similar to a grouse, also living in Scotland, that it's called the ptarmigan. In summer, it's a lovely mottled brown and grey, quite an attractive bird there, again, supposedly to allow it to survive in amongst the brackens and the low-growing vegetation there. In winter, when it snows, these things do turn to, these are true color changes that occur from season to season, and they go through the cycles of summer and winter. And again, this is put down to being for camouflage, but you've got to ask the question, well, how can a change in the environment actually produce the genes that control this process? And they have researched the genetics, and they've worked out how it actually happens. So when evolutionists come up with these throwaway lines, we need to challenge them. How could this happen by the process that you believe in? Rather, is this a design feature that has another function? And if we can just come back to us, I'm sure in our in all of our panel here of everyone, you've probably seen some examples of colour changes in the different places that you live throughout the world. We've talked about Australia. These two examples of the summer and winter coats, they're from Scotland. Any other examples that you have observed?
Okay, so I've dealt with this group of animals for quite a few years now in our business. The cygnathids are the fused jaw group of fish, so it includes the seahorses, sea dragons, pipefish, pipe horses, pygmy pipe horses, and a few creatures like that. And they are incredible camouflages. It's not just colour change. Colour change can be one of them, but they can also have a number of other features which we'll cover. So these are a couple of photos actually taken at our facility. We've had both of those creatures on display, and they're very popular around the world, as you can imagine, in public aquariums for people to go and see, which is part of what our business is. And just during the week, we exported quite a lot of them over to China. Sorry, click on that again. Okay, so here's an example. If you look very closely, you can see the pygmy seahorse, the Barger-Bant's pygmy seahorse, in amongst the coral there. In fact, this is a species of seahorse that was only more recently discovered because it was so good at camouflaging. So someone, I think, collected a piece of this Gorgonian coral, and then part of it moved, and then it was discovered. I don't know if that was Dr. Barger-Bant or someone like that, but that's apparently what happened. Here's another pygmy seahorse, and we did speak about seahorses a month or two ago on the show, and this one, you know, they sort of look deformed, and some of the variations that seahorses have probably devolved into, but this is just showing some of the incredible colour change capabilities. They can show colour changes as spots, but as in the Barger-Bants, if I go back up to that one, it can actually have, people think it can have coral polyps actually living in the skin. That probably needs to be confirmed. Here's another example of the Denise's pygmy seahorse, orange in this instance, on a piece of coral. Here's a pipefish. So you do need to look carefully, but you can note, if you look closely, some of the external growths that they can have on them. So algae and bryozoans and things can actually live in the skin. and they can be incredibly well camouflaged. Here's another type of pipefish, a ghost pipefish, ornate. Some of these actually live in the Sydney area, up through northern Australia and into Southeast Asia. They can be incredibly well camouflaged. Here's another ghost pipefish, and it's particularly camouflaged, that one, because it's got some of those creatures that in its habitat actually living in its skin. So yeah, again, you have to look closely at some of those, but you can imagine the one on the right, another type of ghost pipefish in amongst weed, would be incredibly difficult to see. So just some points on this. They can change their colour, and they've got special chromatophores, they're called, colour changing cells in their skin that they can change many colours and shades of colours. Never really seen a blue seahorse because that's not really a pigment. It's more of a refracted light effect, or green, but there can be shades of green, which is really probably yellows coming in and making them look a little bit green, and maybe a bit of reflection off some of the plants around them. We've had live rock in our displays, and that's quite brown at times, and we've had our seahorses very difficult to see against the brown rock as well. One of the other things that helps a seahorse to hide is its sedentary habit. So in other words, they're always just still. They don't swim a lot, they don't move a great deal, they don't move quickly. As John was alluding to earlier, movement can really alert your attention to something being there. So they're quite slow movers and don't move a great deal. I've mentioned the external growths. A bit of a question mark there on the coral polyps, but that's a possibility. And then in the sea dragons, as I'll show you in a second, they can actually have leafy appendages as part of their actual body. But the interesting thing is, we can get some of these great photos of seahorses, pipefish and the like in habitat that makes them appear camouflaged, but very often they're not camouflaged. And this is in the wild. This is a picture in the wild of a pygmy seahorse. It's white and grey background, and that's quite obvious. So what's really going on? Here's the weedy sea dragon. It's not always hidden either. Sometimes they can be incredibly well hidden, this weedy sea dragon, but other times, and I've seen quite a bit of footage of these creatures in the wild, and while they're hiding in amongst weed, they're not that super difficult to see. So what's really going on? Are they really some of the best examples of evolution? Rudy Kuda, who wrote a very detailed book on sea horses, sea dragons, and the family, in fact called them the ultimate in evolution. Are they? Have they evolved to that? They're often called a very fragile creature. How have they survived millions of years if they're so fragile before they evolved this capability to actually camouflage? That's one question that evolutionists would need to be able to answer, given that there's no known ancestors of these things from what they've evolved from. So a question we can ask is the colour change for other reasons, and really Diane's already covered a lot of this with examples in the chameleon for communication and so on. We also have cuttlefish on display. That's the creature there on the right of that slide, and they can be dramatic colour changes. In fact, they can have like streaks of lightning almost going through their body as displays, and this is clearly understood as either a warning or mating signals. It's nothing to do with camouflage, although they do appear to be able to use it for such. The seahorse on the left is Hippocampus cuda or Hippocampus teneopterus, depending on which classification system you're looking at. the spotted seahorse. It was once called the yellow seahorse, and well, it sometimes still is. It's sometimes called the spotted seahorse, and sometimes it's called the common seahorse. And the reason it's got all these common names is because people were finding black ones and calling them the common seahorse, a yellow one and calling them the yellow seahorse, and that's how the common names. But it's been found that they're actually all the one species. And this seahorse we've had for many years, and it doesn't seem to change colour in order to camouflage. It will often seem to change colour when it's stressed or when it's trying to mate. They can actually change colour before your eyes. The male is coming up to a female, trying to attract her, and instantly they'll change colour, often go paler, go more yellow, and it seems to be very much associated with mating as well. So very similar to the creatures that Diane was pointing out. So just to finish off, here's some questions that maybe the panel can discuss. How would creatures gradually evolve camouflage before they were completely consumed by their predators? Evolution is requiring high numbers of offspring with random mutations to produce things that would then help them to not be seen by their predators. But that's got to happen very quickly before they're all consumed. And I personally can't see that as something that would be valid. Are creatures just using what they've got to survive in a fallen world? I think this is closer to the mark, that creatures have got certain abilities and they use them to survive, and they learn habits. It's well known, for example, that creatures that normally would like to hang out in the daytime and feed. Various Australian marsupials do this, and then humans have moved into the area and start hunting them and so on, and then they change to a nocturnal habit. So often behaviours can change when circumstances change. And the last point I've got there is God, a creator who loves to design things for discovery. And this is just something that I was contemplating after watching a program called The Privileged Planet, where they were basically putting this forward that God is someone that likes us to go out there and discover the beauty of his creation. What do you think, guys?
Okay, now if you don't mind, Craig, if you swap back to me on full camera, please, Joe, I'll add a brief biblical picture here so we can see it in perspective, because if there's one thing creation research is famous or infamous for, is forcing the issue to what it really is. Now, all the people who've criticized our comments on camouflage or variation have got a presupposition that the scientists tell you the truth. Now, we hope we've got across the fact that many times that's not true. They'll tell you what they think would be true if their bigger presupposition of evolution is also true before that. So again, a warning to the theologians who think, hey, we've got to take the scientist's word on the age of the planet, the scientist's word on carbon dating, the scientist's word on no calcification in fossilization. Forget it. Scientists are human. Human are sinners. Yes. You've got to take God as a non-sinner, a revealed creator who's actually given you a perspective that you and I need to humble ourselves and use. So how do we put this camouflaging art, which it seems to be, into perspective? I'll give you my experience, because I live in a place called the Redlands. Now, there's no doubt about it, when I pick up my Bible in the Redlands and read chapter 1, it says nothing got here by accident. Nothing evolved by chance. Everything was deliberately created. And in the beginning, verse 31 of Genesis, it was very good. Now, very good is defined not in terms of morality, but in the terms of diet. All the creatures, Adam and Eve included, ate plants. You did not need to camouflage yourself against an angry avocado. It was not needed at all. So camouflage, if that's what you call it today, did not have a defensive function in the first world. Okay, skip forward many thousands of years to the Redlands. I keep chickens. Many people keep chickens in the Redlands. We have foxes, courtesy of the British who brought them out here. They're not native, and they love chickens. They love chicken coops because they can use their claws to tear apart the wire netting, get in and eat your chicken and escape. But here's what I've noticed. If you bring in a breed of chicken, okay, now I've bred chickens ever since I was a kid. Papa chicken or Papa rooster, mama chicken has little chickens, and they are almost invariably not all the same color. Now, the function of theirs is it doesn't even need to be discussed. We know they end up with various colors, even though you start with the same mum and dad. Okay, they grow up, they're in your chicken yard, and some of them become red. Well, there are some red-headed people in your family and some dark-headed people. The same thing happens with chickens. When you put the red ones out on the red land, they actually seem to be better disguised than the white ones. Along comes hungry fox. It gets into the chicken pen, and almost inevitably it will eat the white ones first. Now, you can argue it eats the white ones first because it can't see the red ones. It doesn't matter what your logic is, you end up with the majority of red ones in the Redlands. And we say they survive because they were camouflaged. Well, you'll soon find out how true that is if you run out of white ones, and all of a sudden you discover that the fox is a little more wily than you thought, and your red ones now start being eaten because it not only visually looks for white ones, they're easy to spot, you can actually smell the red ones and find their hiding spots. But that's his last resort. But we use the term camouflage. But did you notice its origin? And in a real world where God created and everything was good, and foxes only ate grapes like they are recorded as doing in Scripture. They only ate fruit like you can see them actually doing today. They ate vegetables, which you can record and prove. They didn't eat chickens. Your baby chooks would have had any color possible. They would have ended up a rainbow of colors. No fox to eliminate, no natural selection. But natural selection is real, but it actually eliminates the variations which don't fit in the environment. And so when you say it survives because it's camouflaged and red, no, it survives because the fox ate all the other ones. So natural selection is actually reducing your gene pool. The opposite happens when you remove foxes, and like a little town in New Zealand where it's surrounded by beautiful forest in the North Island, no harsh winters, somebody many decades ago let go a few chickens, and the tourists love to feed them. You know the signs in the parks that say don't feed the birds? Well, the tourists feed the chickens. And over the decades, the chickens have bred and counterbred and inbred and crossbred. Some people have bought their new red leghorns in, and you now have a rainbow. I mean, a literal every possible color, every possible size, because the only natural selection is let's feed them, let's fatten them, let's enjoy these chickens. Of course, a bit of a protest. Chickens poop. Poop is slippery. The council is worried about being sued, so don't be surprised that all those chickens have either disappeared now or they soon will, because council as a natural selection pressure is all powerful. It's got brains, and it eliminates all of the possible genetic changes. Okay, go back to a biblical perspective. In the beginning, everything was very good. Natural selection would have only enhanced because it would have been totally positive, not negative. You didn't need to survive an attack. By the time you get to sin, sin brings death. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You Christians need to remember death is not a biological necessity. Death is a penalty for a moral problem started by man and then spread on the whole of creation. A real dilemma when you get to the flood, in which many creatures were rapidly buried, so much so that even their guts are preserved, right? And you can see the evidence of rapid flood-type burial, even in the graptolites down there in Tasmania, where they're all lined up. In fact, Craig, I suggested to you yesterday, you perhaps get some acetic acid or calcite, those little keratin-type stripes, you can probably end up pulling them out and see what a graptolite was like in the real world before it was so rapidly buried, it's actually still there. When you have a look at the flood, a massive fossil interaction, a massive fossil formation resulting. And after the flood, remember, God gave Noah permission to eat meat. Now, he was not told to not eat pork. He was not told he couldn't eat cattle. He was not told to not breed cows in case the climate changed. He was allowed to eat plants and all varieties. There was no unclean creatures. God actually said later on to Peter, why do you call things unclean when I call them clean? Now you go down a little bit further, and by the time you get Israel established in Leviticus chapter 11, you'll find there's a whole series of rules about what the Jewish people alone are told to not eat. In fact, there's clean and unclean as a definition, and you can come up with some generalizations. A clean creature is a vegetarian. They're allowed to eat those by and large. Cows eat grass, you're allowed to eat them. But you find lizards that go around eating up moths or whatever are listed between verse 19 and 30, if I remember correctly, as things that the Jews would have regarded as unclean. Okay, lizards, creeping creatures. Back there in Genesis, all pronounced very good. Noah, you can eat anything that moves. Creeping creatures. Noah could have had roast goanna if he wanted. He could have had crocodile because he was given authority again over all the creatures and he's free to eat them. By the time you get the Jews, the real reason for the clean and unclean definition is not because of the actual creature eating whatever it ate. It's because the Jews are being isolated from all other cultures on the planet. You might have noticed that God never calls them the adults of Israel, only ever the children of Israel, because they were spiritually really in kindergarten. The Holy Spirit was not given. They had no real discernment. Look at the problems Moses had with them. Look at the problems all the leaders had with them. They were the infants of Israel, and God gives them a barrier that makes it so hard for all the cultures around them to intermingle. If you don't believe me, try and invite an Orthodox group of Jews to your church for a meal, a barbecue, roast pork barbecue. You won't get very far because these dietary rules actually separate, and that was their purpose. So you'll find in Leviticus chapter 11, some translations ask the question, what are these creeping things? And some actually put geckos, right? Some, and these are all speculations because it's a creeping thing. Lizards, it covers all sorts of lizards and crocodiles, and you name it, are covered by that rule. So the Jews wouldn't have eaten them at all. But remember, by the time you get to Peter having a vision from the Lord about taking the gospel into the whole world, the gospel, it's God's will. He made it very good. You ruined it. We sinned. Sin brings death. Jesus died. He died for the sin of Adam, which is spread on the whole world. He rose from the dead, and the apostles are sent into all the world to preach the gospel. Okay, if you're a Jew, you can't get very far if you have rules about eating geckos and you're going to a culture that says, here, eat my gecko pie. They do that, by the way. You find that those rules, which were so necessary in isolating the people of Israel, are now ready to be discarded. God's reached his point in history where he says to Peter, don't you dare call anything unclean that I call clean. And also from then, people are allowed to eat anything they like with one provision. They can't eat the blood. They're not to eat strangled things. The same rules God gave to Noah before there were any Jews. You do know Noah was not a Jew. He was not a person of Israel. In fact, Abraham wasn't a Jew. Have you come to grips with that? In fact, when you have a look at me, I'm not a Jew either. But I am a Gentile who's been saved by Christ, just like most of you need to be. And you need to remember, yes, if you feel like it and you need a gecko, God has authorized gecko pie. I don't know what it tastes like. I've no intention of finding out. But that's the big perspective. So what you call camouflage actually fits into part of a degeneration, a good world made bad by sin, degenerating past Noah to where animals need to survive and they kill others. Sad but true, till only the red chickens are left in the redlands, and we call it camouflage. It's not actually, it's one of all the variations, and the camouflage is a negative result, not the positive result of evolution, but the negative result of all other colors being eliminated.